Hypixel Skyblock has received a lot of updates over the years, many of which were talked about in advance. However, there are a fair few updates that were mentioned yet have not come out yet, due to either being scrapped, moved to 1.0, Skyblock's main release, or due to progress being made behind closed doors. This has led to what I affectionately term the Hypixel Skyblock update iceberg, ranging from the guaranteed to the, not guaranteed. These updates were all mentioned in some way, shape, or form over the past couple years, and have the potential to completely change the way the game is played. Without any further ado, I present to you the Hypixel Skyblock Update Iceberg. Starting with updates that are seemingly guaranteed, we have the Foraging update. This is one that I think all of you know about. This has been talked about for years now, but we actually got some concrete information about it a few months back. Basically, it's going to take place in 1.19 or 1.20, depending on how far they want to update the game. It's going to include a mystical forest, new tree types, collections, new GUIs, potentially, and a new critter system, which is going to be a sort of mechanic where you're able to capture, raise, and combine or merge creatures to provide a selection of passive abilities, whatever that ends up being. It also will potentially include the new axe mechanic Sweep, essentially allowing you to break a large number of tree parts very quickly, depending on the level of sweep on an axe. However, if the tree has a certain level of hardness, you won't be able to break it normally. This update is the one that most people are talking about when they're thinking of future Skyblock updates, so let's move on. Next up, we have a dungeons update to make Berserker, the melee class, more viable in dungeons along with some early game enhancements. As well as this, I would imagine that automatically being able to join a dungeon solo would be included in this update. They haven't talked too much about this. This was actually mentioned in a Skyblock Nerds post, which I think is pretty neat. The Skyblock Nerds post was essentially talking about Skyblock Nerds, which, if you don't know, is a little program that Hypixel runs, in which people, community members, are able to contribute to updates in small ways, and as it states here, as of today, projects available to all SBN members for review includes a Dungeons update to make Berserker, Melee, viable in Dungeons along with some early game enhancements. This project is expected to hit the alpha network for public testing when it's ready. There's not too much else to say about this, we haven't seen any specifics here, but it will be nice to see Berserkers get some pretty major buffs. For our final guaranteed update, we have to come to the Rift, and it should be obvious at this point that I'm talking about the mountaintop of the Rift. It's going to be where the last time charm is, it's going to give us a bunch of lore about the world, and it's likely going to be the final part of the Rift Island. I wouldn't be that shocked if they ended up adding more onto it afterwards, but for now that seems to be the final section of the Rift. On top of this is where we're going to get and max out our best necklace in the game, the Rift necklace. There's not too much else to say here. Obviously, there's a lot of lore related to the Rift update that will be talked about and expanded upon here, but that is a guaranteed update. I would be completely shocked and floored if this didn't happen for some reason. Moving on through our update guided tour, we have the first likely update, the attributes update. This one I'm putting pretty high up in likely and fairly low in terms of guaranteed because I don't know for certain if this is going to happen, but it would be very likely. This has already been on the alpha network in some way, shape, or form for a few days actually, and essentially allowed you to put attributes on pretty much every single item. You were able to apply up to 2 attributes to an item, however the admins did state that the attributes on that part of the server were applied in different ways to how it would actually be in game. Essentially, they want to make it so that you're able to use attributes before you get to the Crimson Isle, and I think that's a great idea. However, something like that will likely take a little bit longer to fully flesh out, and that might be the reason why we haven't heard about it too much since its initial release to the alpha network. They state here, if all this goes to plan, attribute shards will be available way before players reach the Crimson Isle, and have significantly more methods of obtaining them. The attribute system will also undergo major changes to make buying, selling, and combining attribute shards easier, with some attribute balancing in between. Overall, this would be an excellent update, and I think that they absolutely should make it so that attributes can be used on anything. However, the chance of it happening is very high, but not 100% in my opinion. Eventually, they'll probably come out with something like this though. Moving on to our next likely update, we have the ability rebalance update. The reason that I'm talking about this and not putting it in guaranteed is because we have very little concrete information for what the admins want to do. It's fairly obvious they do want to rebalance a bunch of things in the game, and it is likely that we get a major rebalance update, but the chances of it are not necessarily 100%, especially since we don't have any concrete information here. What's interesting about this, though, is that there are many items in the game that I think people would want to see rebalanced in some way, shape, or form, many of which were not totally usable right now, and could be made usable in the future. Especially as we get closer to 1.0, I imagine that we see balancing updates happening more often, and something like an ability rebalance update would definitely be part of that. Next up, in terms of updates I consider likely but not guaranteed, we have build changes to multiple areas of the game. This is something that was also stated in the Skyblock Nerds post, and they wrote here, "There's also an ongoing project for build changes where SBN members can propose build changes of any kind to improve the game. This will likely happen in the form of dungeon room improvements, but I also think the Howling Caves could definitely use a revamp. It is too small, too cramped, and frankly it is kind of annoying to traverse. It would be really nice to see some upgrades in this regard, as well as some other places in the game. I would really like to see stuff like that. And obviously they have been making these sorts of updates a ton over the last couple of years, with island revamps, sections of island revamps. The hub got a few changes over the last few months, so yeah, they're definitely still doing stuff like this. It's just not guaranteed in the sense that we don't have like a 100% certainty that certain parts of the game are getting revamped. Next up, in terms of likely updates, we have improvements to quests and lore. This one is fairly obvious. They're going to want to flesh out the lore of the game. It is not 100% guaranteed because once again there isn't anything concrete here, but it's pretty obvious that something like this is very likely to happen over the next few months and even years. They really do want Skyblock to be more of a story-based game, and they started doing that with this weird little end room that you can find on the side of the island. I do hope we get a lot more quests and lore included into the game. They recently made a dungeon update that allowed you to actually collect all the books, and they added some more books along with that so people could put together the lore of dungeons. I'm not really a lore nerd myself, but if this actually happened, I would probably consider getting into that aspect of the game because I do find it interesting. Really would like to see stuff like this come fairly soon. Finally, in terms of likely updates, we have combat masteries, and this one's pretty interesting. They effectively want to add a class-like system to the entire game. Let me read what they want to say. We plan to add 3 masteries, each representing a style of combat in the game, such as melee combat, archery, and magic. Players will be able to choose and join any of these 3 schools of combat and progress in them. Think of them like a Heart of the Mountain, but different for each of the 3 types of combat. You'll be able to swap between them and complete all of them, but only one will be active at the same time. Furthermore, deep inside those masteries, players will be able to select unique sub-masteries that unlock different skill trees. For example, archery might lead to the ninja, marksman, and ranger sub-masteries. This one's pretty interesting, and I do hope it happens. Something like this for 1.0 could really make combat more interesting and unique, especially if a lot of items get rebalanced. Would really like to see something like this, and I'm glad it's being talked about. However, it is not guaranteed because it's been a while since this was discussed. This was in the design thread 8, I believe, of 9, made almost a year ago now. However, it is talked about at such length here that I do believe it is likely to happen, just not right before 1.0 happens. Moving on into the possible section, we have Skyblock chapters. Now, Skyblock chapters was something shown off on alpha for a short period of time. It was essentially going to be a quest line where you were able to look into different parts of the game and do certain parts of the game in order to gain levels, XP, and money. However, with how many updates that Skyblock Levels has gotten over the last year, I really don't think something like Skyblock chapters is necessary anymore, and they have not talked about bringing it back and have essentially removed it from everything on the alpha. I don't think this is going to happen anymore. I'm putting it impossible because they did talk about it previously, and it was pretty concrete on its original release, but I don't think this will happen personally. Moving on, in terms of possible updates, we have moving the entire game to 1.19 or 1.20. The admins state here, quote, "If our first or latest version content update is well received and performs well, we may consider updating the entirety of Skyblock to the latest versions. This is something that would require a tremendous amount of work and also conversations, as it would mean requiring players to be on the latest version to play all Skyblock content. We will discuss this with the community once we get closer to our goals." Now, obviously that seems like something the admins want to do, and the main reason for that is that Minecraft has changed a lot over the last 10 years, and actually being able to use many of these changes in the development of their game is going to be very beneficial. Newer versions are much easier to develop for than 1.8.9, and I think the admins know this by now after doing it for 4 years. Once you move to that newer version, content can be created much more quickly and a lot more efficiently. As well, things like duplication bugs and things like that are less prominent on newer versions of Minecraft, so moving has those benefits as well. I personally think this is a good idea, but obviously many in the community may disagree with me, and that's fine, that's your opinion. But I do think that it's more possible than not that we eventually move to something like 1.19 or 1.20, or at the very least, many of the future islands get made in this newer version. Moving on to our last possible updates, we have the healing and damage nerf to all mobs in the game. They wrote here, unfortunately it means that whenever we need to create difficult content, we have to increase the damage of monsters unreasonably, which is why at any stage of the game, you sometimes almost get one-shot by enemies. Essentially what the admins want to do here is lower the damage but also lower the healing of the player. Essentially what this will do is create a system in which you heal kinda slowly, but you also lose health kinda slowly. It should theoretically make combat more tactical, and I do understand the reasons why they want to do this. However, they haven't followed up on this, and I don't believe they will, because Skyblock content is very much focused on being fast-paced, and I think changing this too much would maybe upset more than a few players. Some people don't like that slower pace of gameplay, and that's fine, they're entitled to not like it. And I think Skyblock for the most part is fairly balanced at the moment, at least balanced around the items we have right now. Although there could always be more items to fill out the niches, I think overall the game is in a pretty decent spot balance-wise. In terms of other updates, we also have the minion personality update. This would include minion personalities, upgrades, and special minions. Essentially what this would do is turn minions into a rankable upgrade system, in which case you could level up certain minions, not through adding more materials to them, but by using them, and that would unlock special slots, or even special minions entirely, that don't necessarily generate resources, but also do things for you. I think this would be pretty neat. I'm putting this in possible because we haven't heard anything about this since it was talked about in the design thread like 2 years ago, so I don't think that this is very likely by any means, but I do think it is fairly interesting to think about, and something that the admins might potentially do as we get closer to 1.0. It's just some food for thought. Finally, at the bottom of the iceberg, we have the unlikely or hard to tell updates, and in this case we have two, notably the Abyss and Guild content. The Abyss was already talked about quite a bit at length in the 9th design document. They wrote here that our vision for this island included peaceful surface content, boat exploration, and an underwater adventure through a deep hole at the center of the island. However, they realized that this would be effectively impossible to do without moving to 1.19 first. Now the reason I put this so low and unlikely is because it requires a lot of things to happen first. First, the admins need to release the Foraging update and it needs to do well. Then they need to convince the community to move the entire game to 1.19, or be okay with making more updates in 1.19 or 1.20. And then, after that, they have to have the impulse and want to make this update. And frankly, I don't see all of that happening. The Abyss seems like it has died off and especially been replaced with other fishing content, and I really don't see it coming in any way, shape, or form. And moving on, we have Guild content, and this one is also pretty sad. Originally, they were going to make a way for Guild content by allowing you to buy, houses in the hub. I don't really see this happening. I don't see this happening anytime soon at the very least. It's a little bit hard to tell. I think this one is more likely than the Abyss itself, but I don't put the chance of it happening at like 50% or higher than that. Overall though, many of these updates, at least not the ones at the very bottom of the Abyss, are at the very least possible, and we could see many of them coming to Skyblock over the next 2 years. So now, at the bottom of the iceberg, you may be asking yourself, Derailious, why didn't you talk about this or that? Why didn't you talk about a new dungeon, for example? Why didn't you talk about new slayers? And if I didn't talk about it in this video, it hasn't been brought up by the admins. The reason I wanted to stray closely to things the admins actually have spoken about is because I wanted this video to be a showcase of all of the ideas that the admins actually had and put out into the world. While they're certainly working on things like new slayers or maybe a new dungeon behind the scenes, we haven't really heard much about any of those things, and that's because the admins want to develop those things behind closed doors and don't really want the player base to know about them yet. For that reason, I've decided to not really talk about them, although it is obvious that eventually we're going to be getting this new content. We just don't know in what form it will be, or if it will be in a year from now or 10. Overall though, I do think this video is a pretty good example of all of the creativity that the admins have poured about all of the parts of the game, and all of the ideas that they've thought of over the last few years kind of combined into one little archive. At the end of the day though, my name is Derailious. Thank you so much for watching this video till the end. Please like and subscribe if you enjoyed. I put a lot of effort into this one. I don't usually for the news videos, but I did want to put in a lot of effort for this one, so I would really appreciate it if you did support it. And look to the future, fellas, because I will see you then.